It's a Sunday night in northern New Jersey, sometime in the winter of 1999, and four men are packed into a car, crawling through the streets of Union County. The heater is running too hot. Somebody's got the radio low. They're headed to a sit-down, the kind of meeting where men who call themselves soldiers and capos settle disputes the old way, quietly, before anyone loses money or blood. But that night, before they get down to business, the conversation drifts somewhere stranger. One of them, a wise guy named Joseph Sclafani, brings up a television show. He's heard people talking about it. He's maybe seen an episode himself. And what he says next, paraphrased from what investigators would later transcribe word for word, amounts to this. What is this thing everyone's calling the Sopranos? And is it supposed to be us? Nobody in that car knows it yet, but the FBI is listening to every word. Not through a bug hidden in a lamp or a phone line, through a wire carried by one of their own passengers. A man who has spent nearly 2 years pretending to be exactly what he no longer is. And the answer to Sclafani's question, the one hanging in the air of that overheated sedan, is yes. Almost certainly, yes. The show airing on HBO on Sunday nights, the one about a New Jersey mob captain juggling a strip club, a dysfunctional family, and a therapist, is built loosely, deniably, but unmistakably, on men like the ones sitting in that car. They keep talking. Another voice, belonging to a soldier named Anthony Rotondo, chimes in with something almost like professional respect, admiration for the acting, for how real it all feels. These are men discussing their own reflection without fully recognizing the mirror. Here is the part they cannot see coming. That recording, this exact conversation about a television show, will not stay a private joke shared in a moving car. It will end up printed in federal court filings. It will be entered into evidence, and it will help send members of their own family to prison on charges that include murder. A television drama would eventually make these men infamous to millions of strangers who never knew their real names. But it wasn't the writing on HBO that put them behind bars. It was their own voices, recorded by the government they'd spent decades trying to outsmart, reacting in real time to a fictional version of themselves, closing a loop so strange that no writer's room would have dared invent it. They had no idea, in that car, that they were about to become the most talked-about crime family in America. Not for anything they'd done, but for what they'd watched on television on Sunday nights. Before we get into it, if you're just settling in for this one, go ahead and drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from tonight, and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting seeing how far this stuff travels. If you're new here, consider subscribing. And if you've got a moment, helps this reach more people who'd probably enjoy it too. This is a long one tonight. The full, true story of the real crime family and the real men who quietly shaped one of the greatest television dramas ever made. Start to finish, no rush. Get comfortable. Here we go. To understand why The Sopranos feels less like a mob show and more like a case study of an ordinary, exhausted man who happens to run a criminal organization, you have to understand the man who wrote it, and the very specific patch of New Jersey he came from. He was born David DeCesar in Mount Vernon, New York, in August of 1945, though the world would come to know him under a shortened, anglicized version of that name, Chase, a small act of reinvention that in its own quiet way foreshadows a show obsessed with the gap between what Italian-American families presented to the world and what actually went on behind closed doors. His family soon relocated to New Jersey, and it was there, in towns like Clifton and later North Caldwell, that young David Chase grew up inside a traditional Italian-American household, the kind with its own unspoken codes, its own hierarchies, its own festering resentments dressed up as normalcy at the dinner table. He was not, by his own account, a particularly happy kid. He has spoken at length in later interviews about a complicated, often painful relationship with his mother, a woman whose moods, whose passive aggression, whose way of making the people around her feel small, would eventually become the genetic material for one of the most memorable, most quietly terrifying maternal figures ever put on American television. If you've seen the show, you already know the character. If you haven't, all you need to know for now is that Chase didn't invent her from nothing. He barely had to invent her at all. What Chase did have to invent, or rather assemble, was everything else. Because alongside the domestic tension of his childhood, there was another undercurrent running through North Jersey in the decades Chase was growing up. Organized crime. Not the glamorous, Tommy gun version of Prohibition-era Chicago. And not, most of the time, the operatic, high-stakes drama of the New York Mafia families, whose names had already become American shorthand: the Gambinos, the Genoveses, the Lucchese's, the Bonanos, the Colombos. Those were the families most Americans thought of when they thought of the Mafia, in large part because New York's organized crime scene had, by the mid-20th century, become genuinely mythologized, chronicled in newspapers, congressional hearings, and eventually in films that turned real bloodshed into something closer to grand opera. New Jersey's mob scene was different, quieter, less romanticized. While the five families ran their operations in the boroughs and made national headlines doing it, an entirely separate criminal organization operated just across the river, embedded in the industrial towns and working-class neighborhoods of Newark, Elizabeth, and the surrounding suburbs. This was the DeCavalcantes crime family, a Cosa Nostra organization with its own boss, its own capos, its own soldiers, its own seat, eventually, at the national table of organized crime bosses known as the Commission. And yet, for decades, this family lived in the shadow of its more famous cousins across the Hudson. Members of the New York families reportedly regarded the DeCavalcantes organization with a kind of good-natured condescension, sometimes referring to them, according to organized crime historians and reporting on the family, with a dismissive nickname, the Farmers, a smaller provincial outfit out in the sticks. Compared to the big city sophistication of Manhattan and Brooklyn's criminal aristocracy, this is the world David Chase grew up adjacent to. Not as a participant, there's no indication Chase himself had any direct involvement in organized crime, but as an observer, a kid absorbing the atmosphere of a state where everyone seemed to know somebody, or know somebody who knew somebody, connected to that world, he has said, in interviews given over the years, that he'd always been fascinated by gangster stories, going back to the classic Warner Brothers crime pictures of the 1930s that he watched as a boy, films that turned real Depression-era criminals into folk anti-heroes for movie audiences. That early fascination with the genre never really left him. It just sat there, waiting for the right moment, the right format, and the right personal crisis to bring it fully to life. Chase's career path to becoming the creator of one of the most acclaimed dramas in television history was neither fast nor obvious. He studied film, first at New York University and then at Stanford, where he began to refine the kind of psychologically dense, character-driven storytelling that would eventually define his work. For years afterward, he toiled largely unglamorously in the television industry, writing and eventually directing episodes for shows like The Rockford Files in the 1970s, and later projects through the 1980s and into the 1990s that rarely, if ever, allowed him the creative freedom he actually wanted. He has described this period of his career somewhat ruefully as decades spent getting paid to write scripts for other people's shows while his own feature film ambitions repeatedly stalled out, never quite making it to production. What finally broke through wasn't a mob story at all, not at first. It was something far more personal. By the mid-1990s, Chase was in psychotherapy himself, working through his own long list of unresolved family tension, and somewhere in that process, an idea began to take shape. What if you took the kind of domestic, generational dysfunction he knew intimately, a demanding, manipulative mother, a son perpetually trying and failing to measure up to some impossible standard of masculine success, and grafted it onto a mob story? Not a mob story about elaborate heists or spectacular gunfights, but one about a man whose professional life happened to be running a criminal enterprise, while his real, unglamorous daily battle was with anxiety, with his own family, with the crushing mundanity of middle-aged American disappointment. A boss who needed a therapist, not because it made for a clever premise, but because Chase himself needed one, and he understood that need intimately enough to put it on screen with total conviction. This is the single most important thing to understand about why The Sopranos ended up being so different from every mob drama that came before it, and why the real men we're about to spend the rest of this video discussing could recognize themselves in it so uncomfortably. Chase wasn't setting out to make a documentary about organized crime. He was making a show about a very specific kind of American manhood in crisis, inherited trauma, suburban ennui, the exhausting performance of strength, and he simply used the New Jersey mob, the world he'd grown up around, as the vehicle to tell that story. Tony Soprano was never going to be a cardboard villain, a stock gangster spouting tough guy one-liners on his way to an inevitable, cathartic death in the final reel. He was designed, from the outset, to be introspective, weak in places you wouldn't expect a mob boss to be weak, funny, in a self-deprecating way that made him disturbingly likable, even as he did monstrous things. Chase wanted an audience to sit with a killer, to understand him, to occasionally root for him, and then to feel guilty about it. But even a character built primarily out of personal psychology and invented family drama needs texture, the specific, grounding, factual details that make a fictional world feel lived in rather than constructed. And for that texture, Chase and his writers turned, consciously and unconsciously, to the very real criminal underworld sitting in his own backyard, real crews, real bosses, real methods of doing business, real internal power struggles, real slang, real front businesses used to launder illegitimate money into something that looked, on paper, respectable, Chase would later tell an interviewer. When pressed directly about how much of the show was invented versus drawn from life, that the vast majority of it, he estimated roughly 90%, was fiction, made up, composite characters, composite events, dramatic license taken wherever the story demanded it. But that remaining 10%, the specific families, the real incidents, the actual men whose lives brushed up against the plot lines Chase was writing, is where this story gets genuinely fascinating. Because that 10% wasn't randomly scattered fictional garnish. It was, according to Chase's own later comments and years of subsequent investigative journalism, patterned quite specifically after real organizations, real bosses, and real events that had played out in New Jersey across several decades. Chase didn't build Tony Soprano out of thin air, and he didn't build the Demio crime family, the show's fictional organization, out of thin air either. He built them layer by layer, out of a handful of very specific real criminal dynasties that operated in the exact towns Chase grew up in and around. And to understand the first and arguably most foundational of those real-world sources, we need to go back to a bugged plumbing supply office, 3 decades before The Sopranos ever aired, and to a boss whose recorded voice would end up telling America, and eventually David Chase, exactly what organized crime in New Jersey actually sounded like. Day to day, argument to argument, murder plot to mundane complaint about a nephew who wasn't pulling his weight. His full name was Simone Rizzo DeCavalcanti, though almost nobody who mattered in his world ever called him that. To the men who worked for him, and eventually to newspaper readers across the country, he was known by a nickname born of pure, mundane cover business logic, Sam the plumber. Born in 1913, some records list 1912. DeCavalcante rose over the course of several decades from a working member of New Jersey's fractured, often disorganized criminal underworld into the singular, unifying force who would transform it into something resembling the disciplined, hierarchical crime families operating across the river in New York. Before DeCavalcante consolidated power, the New Jersey Italian-American underworld had, by most historical accounts, been something closer to a loose, quarrelsome scattering of independent operators and rival crews, competing and occasionally warring with one another, rather than functioning as a single coordinated organization. It was, in the words of more than one crime historian, looking back on the era, something like a Wild West patchwork of gangland activity, without the kind of top-down structure that gave New York's five families their durability and their fearsome reputation. DeCavalcante changed that, taking control of the organization through the 1950s. He built what had been a disorganized network of criminal factions into something disciplined enough to earn its own official seat on the National Mafia Commission, the governing body made up of the bosses of the country's most powerful crime families, the same body that arbitrated disputes between the five families of New York. Under DeCavalcante's leadership, the family he now headed doubled its number of formally initiated, made members, expanding its footprint across illegal gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and eventually construction and waste management, the kind of unglamorous, blue-collar criminal enterprises that would generate steady, dependable cash flow for decades, largely outside the spotlight that followed the flassier New York organizations. And like so many mob bosses of his generation, DeCavalcante understood the value of a plausible day job. He owned and operated a heating and air conditioning company, Kenilworth Heating and Air Conditioning, based in Kenilworth, New Jersey, which functioned as both a legitimate source of declared, taxable income and a convenient office from which to conduct considerably less legitimate business. It's from this business that his enduring nickname was born. He was also, colorfully, known in some circles as the Claw, a reputation earned through his activities as a loan shark charging brutally usurious interest rates, and somewhat more theatrically, as the Count, on account of a family story, never definitively verified, that he was descended from Italian nobility. For years, DeCavalcante ran his organization the way any experienced, cautious boss might, carefully, quietly, using his legitimate businesses as camouflage and his reputation for discipline to keep the family's internal politics from spilling out into the kind of public, bloody chaos that periodically embarrassed the New York families and drew unwanted law enforcement attention. He also served, at various points, as something of a diplomatic go-between for the larger Mafia Commission, notably acting as a liaison during the internal conflict that broke out within the Bonanno crime family of New York in the 1960s, a period of internecine warfare significant enough in mob history to be remembered simply as the Bonanno War. DeCavalcante's willingness and evident skill at this kind of high-level mediation says something about how the New York families actually regarded him. Whatever condescending nicknames circulated informally, he may have run what outsiders dismissively called a farm league operation, but he was trusted enough to help keep the peace among the majors. None of that discretion, however, was enough to save him from what would become one of the most significant and consequential law enforcement operations in the history of American organized crime surveillance, beginning in the early 1960s and continuing for several years. The Federal Bureau of Investigation initiated an extensive surveillance operation targeting DeCavalcante and his closest associates. Agents installed hidden microphones and wiretaps at multiple locations connected to the family across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Most critically, inside DeCavalcante's own plumbing and heating supply office, the very room where he conducted the bulk of his daily criminal business under the assumption of total privacy. This operation would come to be known, in FBI parlance, and later in journalism and popular history, by a couple of different names, sometimes referred to as the Goodfella tapes, sometimes as the DeCavalcante papers. Whatever name it went by, its impact was staggering. For roughly 4 years, federal agents listened, recorded, and transcribed nearly everything said within earshot of those hidden devices. What emerged from those years of surveillance? Once portions of the material became public in the summer of 1969, was nothing short of a national sensation. The FBI ultimately released more than 2,000 pages of transcripts, by some accounts as many as 2,300 pages, capturing DeCavalcante and his inner circle discussing, in unfiltered detail, the actual daily operations of a mafia family. This wasn't a stylized Hollywood depiction of organized crime, all whispered threats and cinematic menace. It was something far stranger, and in its own way, far more compelling. The sound of ordinary human tedium bleeding directly into the sound of organized violence. On these tapes, according to reporting from the period and subsequent historical accounts, DeCavalcante and his men could be heard griping about money owed, complaining about disrespectful subordinates, navigating jealousy and ego within the crew, worrying about their own families, the same kinds of domestic irritations that fill any workplace, any household, interspersed, sometimes within the same conversation with cold, matter-of-fact discussion of extortion schemes, and on occasion, plans involving violence and murder. It was this jarring juxtaposition, the banal sitting shoulder to shoulder with the brutal, that made the DeCavalcante tapes so historically significant and so quietly influential on everything that came afterward in American popular culture's understanding of organized crime. Before this material became public, most Americans' conception of the Mafia had been shaped almost entirely by sensationalized press coverage, congressional hearing testimony, and increasingly, Hollywood filmmaking, a mythology of secretive, almost superhuman criminal masterminds operating according to some grand coherent code of honor. What the DeCavalcante tapes offered instead was something far more intimate and, frankly, far more mundane. The sound of a group of men running what was, in structural terms, a business, an illegal one, staffed by violent people, but a business nonetheless, complete with office politics, personnel problems, and a boss who sounded, in long stretches of transcript, less like Don Corleone and more like an aggravated, harried middle manager trying to keep his operation from falling apart. The public and legal fallout from the wiretap was severe. In 1969, DeCavalcante and 54 of his associates were formally indicted, largely on charges connected to an enormous illegal gambling operation. The tapes had helped expose federal investigators estimated the racket was generating roughly $20 million a year. DeCavalcante was also separately charged in connection with an extortion conspiracy. He would eventually plead guilty to running the gambling operation and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, of which he ultimately served approximately 2 years before his release, reportedly due to good behavior combined with deteriorating heart problems. Separately, a New York State report issued around this period alleged that DeCavalcante's family, together with another organized crime family, controlled as much as 90% of the pornography shops operating in New York City, a claim that, whatever its precise accuracy, speaks to just how far the family's illicit business interests had come to extend beyond New Jersey's borders by the late 1960s. DeCavalcante's formal reign as boss lasted, depending on how various historical sources count the years, from the late 1950s through the early 1980s. Even after his 1969 exposure and subsequent imprisonment, He retained enough authority and internal respect to appoint an acting boss to run day-to-day operations in his absence, a man named Giovanni Ricci, known within the organization as John the Eagle, before eventually stepping back into a fully retired role by the early to mid-1980s. Although law enforcement and organized crime historians have long suspected he continued to exert influence in an advisory capacity, even after formally relinquishing control. Sam the Plumber DeCavalcante died in February of 1997 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, at the age of 83, passing away notably just 2 years before The Sopranos would premiere on HBO and turn the world he'd spent his life quietly running into unlikely television gold. Now here's where the historical thread starts to weave directly, if quietly, into the fabric of David Chase's fictional creation. The DeCavalcante tapes were not just a law enforcement triumph or a journalistic sensation confined to 1969. They became, in the decades that followed, a foundational primary source, arguably the single most detailed and authentic public record of how an actual American Mafia family conducted its internal business. On tape, in its own members' own words, for anyone researching organized crime culture in the following decades, including anyone developing a television drama, attempting to portray that culture with a level of authenticity beyond the operatic, mythologized version audiences had already seen 100 times in gangster films. The DeCavalcante transcripts were an obvious, rich resource. They demonstrated, in exhaustive and often unglamorous detail, that real mob bosses spent as much time worrying about petty grievances and family stress as they did plotting violence, that the emotional texture of organized crime leadership was closer to exhausted middle management than to cinematic villainy. This is precisely the tension David Chase would go on to dramatize. Deliberately or not, at the center of his own fictional boss, there's also a more direct structural echo worth noting, though it's subtle enough that most casual viewers of the show likely never registered it. In the fictional world of The Sopranos, the head of the DiMeo crime family prior to Tony Soprano's rise is an elderly patriarch named Ercole DiMeo, referred to within the show, mostly in passing dialogue and backstory, rather than any extended on-screen storyline, by the nickname Ercole DiMeo. In the show's mythology, had been sent to prison, leaving a power vacuum that set off years of internal maneuvering before Tony eventually consolidated control. It's a storyline mentioned only briefly across the series, almost as background texture rather than active plot, but the shape of it, an aging, respected boss removed from active leadership by a federal prosecution, followed by a messy, extended period of internal jockeying to determine who would take his place, maps closely onto the real trajectory the DeCavalcante organization went through in the years following Sam the Plumber's 1969 conviction and eventual incarceration. Chase never publicly confirmed a direct one-to-one connection between DeCavalcante and the fictional Ercole DiMeo, and given how heavily fictionalized and composited the show's characters generally were, it would be inaccurate to describe this as anything more than a structural echo, a shape borrowed from history rather than a documented, deliberate homage. But the parallel is there for anyone who knows the real history to notice. A real boss, exposed and imprisoned by an unprecedented wiretap operation, indirectly setting the template for how a fictional crime family's leadership vacuum would eventually be dramatized on prestige television 30 years later. What Sam the Plumber's story ultimately provides, then, isn't a direct character template the way some of the other real figures we're about to discuss would go on to provide. Tony Soprano isn't Sam DeCavalcante in any meaningful, literal sense. The two men's lives, personalities, and specific circumstances diverge considerably. What DeCavalcante's story provides instead is something more foundational, the very possibility of the show's entire creative approach. The DeCavalcantes tapes proved, on the public record, in the government's own words, that real Mafia bosses were exhausted, petty, anxious, sentimental, and boring in exactly the same proportions that they were violent and calculating. They proved that the emotional interior of organized crime leadership could be genuinely compelling material worth spending thousands of hours transcribing, worth building an entire prosecution around, worth decades later mining for a television drama that wanted its central mob boss to feel like a real, psychologically complicated human being rather than a genre archetype. Before there could be a Tony Soprano sitting in a psychiatrist's office talking about his mother, there first had to be a real boss, recorded without his knowledge for years, revealing, entirely by accident, exactly how mundane and how human the daily grind of running a crime family actually was. But if Sam DeCavalcantes' story establishes the emotional and factual blueprint that made a show like The Sopranos conceivable in the first place, it's a different man entirely. A man who would come to power decades later, right as David Chase was actually developing his scripts, who provides the single most specific, most extensively documented real-world template for Tony Soprano the character. A man whose own strip club would become the direct inspiration for the show's most iconic set. A man whose relationship with a younger protege would echo one of the show's most emotionally central dynamics. A man who, unlike DeCavalcante, would live to watch The Sopranos air in real time, while he himself was still active in the very organization the show was drawing from. His name was Vincent Palermo. Most people who knew him called him Vinny Ocean. And his story, his rise, his strip club, his mentorship of a younger crew member, and his eventual, quietly unglamorous fall is where we're headed next. If Sam the Plumber DeCavalcante gave America its first real, unfiltered glimpse into the daily emotional texture of Mafia leadership, it's Vincent Palermo who gives us something far closer to a direct character study. A real man whose life, whose business interests, whose relationships, and whose eventual choices track so closely to the fictional Tony Soprano that multiple journalists, documentary filmmakers, and organized crime historians have, over the years, come to regard him as the single most compelling real-world candidate for the character's inspiration. Vincent Palermo was born in Brooklyn, New York, in June of 1944, and raised in what's been described as a fairly traditional Italian-American household, not dissimilar, structurally at least, from the kind of household David Chase himself grew up in. Just a few years earlier, and a state away, as a young man, Palermo went to work at the Fulton Fish Market, the sprawling wholesale seafood market that had, for generations, served as both a legitimate economic engine for New York City and a notoriously fertile recruiting ground and operational base for organized crime. The fish trade's cash-heavy, physically demanding, tightly clannish culture made it an ideal environment for mob influence to take root. And it did for decades. It was during this period of his life, working the docks and stalls of the market, that Palermo picked up the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his criminal career, Vinny Ocean. Palermo eventually made his way into the orbit of the DeCavalcante crime family, not by pure chance, but in part through family connections. Genealogical and journalistic research into his background has established that Palermo was connected to Sam DeCavalcante himself by marriage, making him, by the time of his later ascension within the organization, something like a nephew-in-law to the very boss whose bugged office conversations had exposed the family to the world a generation earlier. It's a detail that quietly underscores just how insular and interconnected these organizations tended to be, how thoroughly criminal life and family life intertwined, generation after generation, within families like the DeCavalcantes. Palermo's rise within the organization followed a trajectory that will sound immediately almost uncannily familiar to anyone who has watched even a handful of episodes of The Sopranos. He built his reputation and earned his formal promotion within the family's ranks through violence, specifically through his involvement in the killing of a real estate developer named Fred Weiss. The details of the murder, as reported across multiple journalistic accounts of Palermo's career, describe Palermo and several associates carrying out the killing, an act that, however brutal, functioned within the internal logic of the organization as a kind of proof of loyalty and capability. In the aftermath, Palermo was elevated to the rank of capo, a captain, given his own crew of soldiers to command, answerable to him the way his own crew answers to a boss above them. It's the exact same rank structure, the exact same mechanism of advancement through demonstrated violence that defines Tony Soprano's own rise within the fictional Demio organization before the events of the series even begin. But it wasn't simply Palermo's rank, or the manner in which he earned it, that would eventually catch the attention of journalists and documentary filmmakers looking for the real Tony Soprano. It was the specific, granular details of the life he built once he reached the upper tiers of the organization, details that map onto the fictional show with a precision that goes well beyond generic mob boss archetype. Chief among these is the strip club. By the 1990s, as Vincent Palermo's influence within the DeCavalcantes family continued to grow, he became the owner and operator of a New Jersey strip club called Wiggles. This wasn't merely a business. Palermo happened to have some financial stake in among many others. Wiggles functioned much the way the fictional Bada Bing functions for Tony Soprano and his crew throughout the HBO series, as something closer to a headquarters. A place where crew members gathered, where business got discussed, where the ordinary rhythms of criminal enterprise played out against a backdrop of loud music and dim lighting. Hidden in plain sight as just another gentleman's club along a New Jersey commercial strip, multiple entertainment journalists and organized crime writers, drawing on reporting that emerged particularly in the wake of the 2006 documentary The Real Sopranos, have identified Wiggles as the specific, direct, real-world model for the Bada Bing, the strip club that serves, across all 6 seasons of the HBO series, as Tony Soprano's unofficial second office, the place where he holds court, adjudicates disputes among his crew, and periodically retreats from the mounting pressures of both his criminal enterprise and his increasingly strained home life. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how specific and consequential this single detail is to the show's overall texture. The Bada Bing isn't incidental set dressing in The Sopranos. It's one of the show's most iconic, most frequently returned to locations, practically a character in its own right by the time the series concludes. The choice to make a strip club the organization's informal headquarters, rather than a more traditional social club or restaurant back room of the kind more commonly associated with New York's 5 families, gives the show a specific flavor, a specific kind of casual, seedy intimacy that distinguishes it from decades of prior mob fiction. And that choice, according to the reporting that's accumulated in the years since the show aired, wasn't an arbitrary creative decision. It was drawn, whether directly through research or absorbed more diffusely through Chase's decades of proximity to New Jersey's criminal underworld, from the very real fact that a New Jersey mob boss named Vincent Palermo ran his organization's daily affairs out of a strip club he personally owned. Palermo's path to the top of the DeCavalcante family, however, wasn't a smooth, orderly succession. It came, as it so often does in organized crime, through a violent and chaotic internal power struggle, one that itself bears a striking structural resemblance to plot developments the show would go on to dramatize. By the early to mid-1990s, the DeCavalcante family's leadership had become deeply unstable. The longtime boss, Giovanni Ricci, the same John the Eagle, who had once served as Sam DeCavalcante's acting successor decades earlier, was in federal prison, having been convicted on racketeering charges in his absence. The family attempted to govern itself through a ruling panel rather than a single boss, a common mob solution to incarcerated leadership, but one that frequently proves unstable in practice, since it distributes authority among men who don't always agree, and who often harbor their own private ambitions. One of the men elevated to a position of acting authority during this period, a capo named Gaetano Corky Vestola, was himself soon arrested and imprisoned, further destabilizing the chain of command. Into this vacuum stepped a man named John D'Amato, who was elevated to the position of acting boss. D'Amato's tenure, however, would prove to be brief and disastrous, for reasons that speak volumes about the brutal, rigid, and often lethal codes governing conduct within traditional organized crime families of this era. According to multiple journalistic accounts of the DeCavalcante family's internal history, it was discovered that D'Amato was bisexual, and that he had reportedly been spending time at swingers clubs. Within the deeply conservative, hypermasculine internal culture of the organization, this discovery was treated not as a private matter, but as an existential threat to D'Amato's authority and standing his own men. According to reporting on the incident, concluded that a boss whose sexuality diverged from the traditional, rigidly enforced norms of the organization could not be trusted to command respect, and posed a liability the family could not tolerate. D'Amato was killed by his own men. It was in the direct aftermath of this violent, internally sanctioned killing that Vincent Palermo rose to become the de facto boss of the DeCavalcante crime family, not through a clean, orderly line of succession, but by stepping into a leadership vacuum created by an act of brutal internal enforcement against a predecessor whose secret life had made him, in the eyes of his own organization, unfit to lead. It's a sequence of events that echoes, in its broad emotional shape, if not its specific details, several of the power struggles the fictional Dimeo family experiences across the run of The Sopranos: leadership contested, secrets weaponized, violence used not against external enemies, but against the organization's own compromised members as a means of restoring order and asserting control. Once in power, Palermo governed the DeCavalcante family through the back half of the 1990s, precisely the years during which David Chase was developing, writing, and eventually filming the pilot episode of what become The Sopranos. This overlapping timeline matters enormously to understanding why so much of the show's texture feels so specifically, uncannily contemporary to the real DeCavalcante organization's actual operations during this period, rather than feeling like a period piece drawing on decades-old organized crime history. While Chase was writing about a fictional New Jersey mob boss running his crew out of a strip club, worrying about internal loyalty, and grappling with the shifting, precarious politics of leadership, a real New Jersey mob boss named Vincent Palermo was, at that very moment, doing almost exactly that. Just a few towns over, beyond the strip club and the mechanics of his rise to power, one particular relationship in Palermo's real life has drawn especially close comparison to one of the show's most emotionally central dynamics: the bond between Tony Soprano and his young protégé, Christopher Moltisanti, within the fictional world of the series. Tony treats Christopher, technically a distant relative by marriage, as something between a nephew and a surrogate son, mentoring him, protecting him, alternately indulging and disciplining him, in a relationship that carries real emotional weight across the show's entire run, right through to its devastating conclusion. Journalists examining Palermo's real life have drawn comparisons between this fictional dynamic and Palermo's own relationships within his crew, a boss whose management style, according to multiple accounts, blended genuine personal investment in his subordinates with the transactional, often ruthless calculus that organized crime inevitably demands. It's less a single one-to-one documented relationship, unlike, say, the strip club, which has a clean, direct real-world analog, and more a pattern, a management style, that observers of both the fictional show and the real family have noted as strikingly similar in emotional texture. Perhaps the most consequential parallel between Palermo's real story and the fictional arc of The Sopranos, however, comes not from his years in power, but from how his story eventually ended, a resolution that would set his real biography apart from the character he's most often compared to, in a way that reveals something important about the fundamental difference between crafted fiction and messy, unglamorous reality. As federal investigators intensified their pressure on the DeCavalcante family through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, building cases, in part, on years of accumulated wiretap evidence, not unlike the surveillance operation that had brought down Sam DeCavalcante decades earlier, Palermo, like several other members of his own organization, ultimately chose to cooperate with federal authorities. He confessed to a range of crimes accumulated over his decades in the organization and entered into a cooperation agreement, providing information to prosecutors in exchange for a significantly reduced sentence. He would go on to enter the federal witness protection program, disappearing under a new identity, his fate diverging sharply, and in its own quiet way, just as dramatically, from the operatic, unresolved tension the fictional Tony Soprano's story carries all the way through to the show's famously ambiguous final scene. This detail, a real boss whose story ends not in violent confrontation or prison, but in quiet, government-brokered disappearance, became one of the central threads explored in the 2006 documentary The Real Sopranos, a production that set out specifically to draw direct comparisons between the fictional world David Chase had built and the very real New Jersey criminal organization operating in its shadow. The documentary, featuring interviews with organized crime historians, former law enforcement figures, and journalists who had covered the DeCavalcante family extensively over the years, methodically laid out the parallels between Palermo's biography and the fictional Tony Soprano's, the strip club, the rise through violence, the internal power struggle, the mentorship of younger crew members, while also being careful to note the ways the comparison inevitably breaks down. Palermo's real cooperation with federal authorities was not an isolated, individual betrayal dramatized for narrative effect, the way certain plot lines within the show handle informants. It was part of a broader, well-documented pattern within the real DeCavalcante organization during this period. As pressure from decades of accumulated federal surveillance and prosecution gradually eroded the family's internal cohesion, pushing numerous members and associates over the years to make the same calculated choice Palermo made: cooperate, testify, and accept a diminished but survivable future, rather than risk decades in federal prison protecting an organization that, by the early 2000s, was itself in serious structural decline. It's worth sitting with the strangeness of this timeline for a moment, because it's genuinely unusual in the history of American popular culture most of the time. When a film or television drama draws inspiration from real organized crime figures, those figures are safely historical by the time the fictional treatment arrives, dead, imprisoned for decades, or otherwise sufficiently removed from the present that the dramatization functions essentially as period history. That is not what happened here. Vincent Palermo was actively serving as the de facto boss of a real, functioning organized crime family at the exact moment David Chase was writing the pilot script for a television show that would go on to draw so heavily, if diffusely and through composite characters rather than direct biography, on the texture of Palermo's own criminal enterprise. And Palermo, unlike Sam DeCavalcante, lived to see the show air. He was still active, still running his crew out of a strip club uncannily similar to the fictional one about to appear on HBO. Right as The Sopranos became a cultural phenomenon, which brings us back, finally, to where this whole story began, to a bugged office, a recording device, and a room full of real wise guys sitting in front of a television set in 1999, watching a fictional version of their own lives play out in front of them, and slowly, uneasily, starting to recognize themselves. Let's return now to that room, to the recording equipment quietly running in the background of a federal surveillance operation targeting the DeCavalcanti crime family in the spring of 1999, capturing not the usual business of extortion and gambling debts, but something far stranger. Men who had spent their entire adult lives inside organized crime, sitting down in front of a television set, watching a fictional version of themselves for the very first time. By this point in our story, you already know who these men most likely were, or were connected to. The organization under surveillance was the same DeCavalcante family Sam the plumber had built into a disciplined, commission-recognized operation decades earlier, the same family that Vincent Palermo, in the years immediately preceding this recording, had risen to lead as its de facto boss, running his crew out of a strip club that would go on to become, almost beat for beat, the template for the fictional Bada Bing. In other words, this wasn't some random group of low-level wise guys stumbling onto a TV show that happened to be about organized crime in general. This was, in a very real sense, the actual organization whose internal culture, knowingly or not, directly or through years of diffuse cultural osmosis, had helped shape the show they were now watching. The specifics of what these men said, as captured on the surveillance recordings, and later reported by multiple outlets covering the case, are worth dwelling on, because they capture something genuinely remarkable: real organized crime figures, encountering their own fictionalized reflection and being visibly unsettled by how precise that reflection turned out to be. According to reporting on the tapes, one voice can be heard wondering, with a mixture of confusion and suspicion, what exactly this new show on HBO was supposed to be, whether it was somehow about them specifically. A conversation reportedly turned to specific, granular details the show had included, a reference to a neighborhood pork store, the exact kind of small Italian specialty grocery that served, in real life, as an informal gathering spot for men in their world, and a reference to a topless club depicted in the series, bearing an unmistakable resemblance to the very kind of establishment their own organization was known to operate. It's worth pausing here to consider just how unusual this moment is, historically speaking. Organized crime figures being captured on federal surveillance, discussing crimes, discussing loyalty, discussing money. That's the ordinary, expected content of decades of FBI wiretap operations targeting the Mafia, going back to Sam DeCavalcante's own bugged office in the 1960s. But organized crime figures being captured on federal surveillance discussing a television show, and specifically discussing how uncomfortably accurate that show felt to their own lived experience. That's something else entirely. It's a documented moment where the machinery of law enforcement surveillance, built to capture evidence of criminal conspiracy, ended up instead capturing something closer to cultural criticism. Real gangsters, functioning as unwitting television critics, reviewing a prestige HBO drama in real time, and concluding with evident unease that it was hitting uncomfortably close to home. And this wasn't merely a curious footnote buried in the FBI's case files, destined to remain a quiet historical oddity known only to a handful of investigators and legal specialists. These recordings, the actual conversations in which DeCavalcante family members and associates discussed The Sopranos, were subsequently used as evidence in a federal criminal prosecution. Portions of this surveillance material contributed to a case that led to convictions against several Men connected to the family on charges including murder, racketeering, extortion, illegal gambling, and bribery. In other words, the same recording equipment that happened to capture a room full of wise guys nervously discussing a TV show also captured, in the surrounding conversations, enough evidence of actual ongoing criminal activity to help send some of those very men to federal prison. A television drama had become entirely inadvertently a supporting character in its own real-world source material's criminal prosecution. A loop so strange it's difficult to imagine even David Chase, working at the height of his creative powers, inventing something quite this layered. What does this moment ultimately tell us? Not just as a strange piece of true crime trivia, but as a window into how effectively the show's writers, consciously or not, had tapped into the actual texture of contemporary organized crime life in New Jersey? It suggests, first and most obviously, that whatever combination of research, cultural osmosis, and Chase's own decades of proximity to North Jersey's Italian-American underworld had gone into building the show, it had produced something startlingly, specifically accurate. Accurate enough that men who were actually living that life, at that exact moment, in that exact region, recognized their own world, reflected back at them in granular, almost uncomfortable detail. This wasn't a generic mob show trading in familiar genre tropes borrowed wholesale from The Godfather or Goodfellas. This was a show specific enough to reference the precise kind of neighborhood pork store where real crews congregated, specific enough to build its entire social headquarters around a strip club model that a real boss, in the same region, at the same time, was actually running. It also tells us something more subtle, and in some ways more unsettling, about how organized crime figures themselves related to their own portrayal in popular culture. The reaction captured on tape wasn't one of simple flattery, nor was it one of pure outrage or denial. It was something closer to genuine unease, a recognition, mixed with something like professional curiosity, mixed with a low-grade paranoia that presumably comes standard with a life spent constantly evaluating threats and exposure. These were men who understood, on some level, that being seen this clearly, even in fictional form, carried real risk. A show precise enough to accurately depict the internal texture of your world is also, implicitly, a show precise enough that federal investigators studying your organization might notice the same parallels, might, in fact, use your own reactions to that show as one more thread of evidence in building a case against you, which is, as it turned out, exactly what happened. There's a broader historical irony worth sitting with here, too. Decades earlier, it had been Sam DeCavalcante's own recorded voice, captured without his knowledge in his own plumbing supply office, that had given America and, eventually, Hollywood and television writers an unprecedented blueprint for what mob life actually sounded like day to day. Now, a generation later, that same family, still operating in roughly the same territory, was being recorded once again, this time reacting to a fictional television drama that had absorbed and reflected back exactly the kind of texture those earlier tapes had first revealed to the public. The DeCavalcante family had, in a sense, been surveilled into cultural relevance twice over. First, as raw source material, unknowingly providing the emotional and procedural texture that would eventually inform a genre-defining television drama. And second, as an unwitting audience, captured on tape, marveling at how thoroughly that same texture had been absorbed and returned to them as entertainment. This is, in the end, the fullest resolution of the moment we open this story with. What began as a strange, almost cinematic true crime hook, a crime family accidentally watching a mirror of itself, turns out, on closer historical examination, to be something considerably deeper than a clever coincidence. It's the natural, almost inevitable outcome of a television show built, layer by layer, out of real events, real relationships, and real organizational culture, drawn from a specific real crime family operating in a specific real region of New Jersey across several overlapping decades. The DeCavalcanti family didn't just inspire the Sopranos in some vague, diffuse background sense. They watched it happen. They watched themselves dramatized, broadcast weekly into millions of American living rooms. And the FBI happened to be listening when they did. The case those recordings eventually became part of is worth naming directly, because it shows just how far this strange loop actually traveled through the federal court system. The surveillance operation capturing these conversations ran alongside a broader racketeering investigation into the DeCavalcanti family that stretched across the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. And when prosecutors eventually built their case, portions of the tapes discussing the show weren't left on the cutting room floor as irrelevant chatter. They were entered into the record. Defense attorneys, according to accounts of the proceedings, pushed back on this, arguing that a group of men discussing a television drama had no real bearing on the actual charges at hand: extortion, illegal gambling, murder conspiracy, and that playing those recordings for a jury risked doing exactly what any defense attorney would fear: letting jurors hear their client's sound, however briefly, like ordinary guys with ordinary opinions about a popular TV show, humanizing them in a way that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. Or alternatively, letting the tapes imply guilt by association, as if enjoying a mob drama were itself evidence of being a mobster. Prosecutors, for their part, maintained that the recordings were simply further proof that the voices on tape were exactly who the government said they were: men embedded deeply enough in that world to recognize its granular details on screen, reacting the way only genuine insiders would react. What's easy to miss, looking back on this now with the benefit of hindsight, is that the tapes didn't just capture recognition. They captured something closer to professional evaluation. According to reporting on the recordings, the men discussing the show didn't only marvel at the accuracy of the pork store or the strip club, they debated it. The way anyone might debate whether a workplace drama got the small details of their own job right or wrong. It's a small distinction, but an important one. This wasn't simple flattery. It was closer to a group of career tradesmen watching a film about their trade, checking the details against their own lived experience, and finding to their evident unease that the writers had done their homework. If Sam DeCavalcante gave the show its emotional and procedural blueprint, and Vincent Palermo gave it its most specific real-time character template, there's a third organization whose fingerprints are, according to David Chase's own comments over the years, arguably even more directly woven into the fabric of The Sopranos than either of the two families we've already discussed. This is the Boiardo crew of Newark, New Jersey, an organization that predates both Sam DeCavalcante's rise and Vincent Palermo's tenure by decades, and whose story reaches back into an even older, raw, more foundational era of New Jersey organized crime. At the center of this story is a man named Ruggiero Boiardo. Though virtually no one who knew him used that name, he was known, across his many decades of operation in and around Newark, as Richie the Boot Boiardo, a nickname whose exact origin has been debated by organized crime historians, though it stuck to him for the entirety of a criminal career that stretched from the gang wars of Prohibition era New Jersey all the way into the latter decades of the 20th century. Boiardo rose to prominence as a high-ranking capo within the Genovese crime family's New Jersey operations, and over the course of his career, he became, according to multiple journalistic and historical accounts, one of the most powerful and feared organized crime figures in the entire Newark underworld, widely regarded, in his prime, as something close to the king of criminal activity in the city. Boiardo's origins in organized crime trace back to the fiercely competitive, often brutally violent gang wars that characterized New Jersey's underworld during the Prohibition era, well before the more centralized, commission-governed structure that would later come to define families like the DeCavalcantes. According to accounts drawn from historical research into his life, Boiardo assembled his own criminal crew as a young man and fought his way to dominance against rival factions in classically brutal fashion, including, according to research into the period, the killing of rival gang members as he consolidated his territory. From that violent foundation, Boiardo built what would become, over subsequent decades, a smuggling and racketeering empire centered on Newark, expanding his influence deep into the city's political and economic life through a combination of intimidation, strategic bribery, and carefully cultivated relationships with local power brokers and politicians. By the time Boiardo reached the later decades of his life, he had accumulated enough wealth and stature to construct what became something of a local legend. In its own right, a sprawling, fortress-like estate in the affluent suburb of Livingston, New Jersey, accessible via a notably long private driveway. This detail, the long driveway leading up to an imposing suburban estate, has drawn direct, repeated comparison from journalists and fans alike to one of the most recognizable visual signatures of The Sopranos. Tony, Soprano's own suburban home in the fictional town of North Caldwell, New Jersey, which the show repeatedly frames through the image of Tony walking down his own long driveway, often in his bathrobe, to retrieve the morning newspaper, a recurring visual motif so associated with the series that it became something of a cultural shorthand for the show's entire tone, blending suburban domesticity with the ever-present undercurrent of criminal menace. But the connections between the Boiardo organization and the Sopranos run considerably deeper than shared real estate aesthetics. As Richie the Boot aged into his later years, leadership responsibilities increasingly passed to his son, Anthony Boiardo, known within the organization and in subsequent reporting on the family as Tony Boy, the parallel to the fictional show's own central character, sharing not just the first name Tony, but the specific father-son succession dynamic at the heart of so much of the series' plot, has been noted repeatedly by journalists and historians examining the show's real-world roots. Parallel that becomes even more pointed once you know the specifics of what Tony Boy, Boiardo's life and leadership actually looked like. By the late 1960s, according to reporting drawn from research into the Boiardo family's history, including material from a book written in collaboration with one of Boiardo's own descendants, the Newark mob under Tony Boy's nominal leadership had fallen into a state of genuine disarray. Tony Boy himself was, according to these accounts, suffering from severe, debilitating ulcers, a physical manifestation of the immense psychological pressure of running a criminal organization he was, by several accounts, ill-equipped to lead. Meanwhile, his aging father, Richie the Boot, by this point approaching 80 years old, and reportedly far more interested in tending his garden and enjoying the considerable comforts his decades of criminal success had afforded him, kept finding himself pulled back into active involvement, unable to fully step back from an organization that continued to falter without his direct oversight. This dynamic, a burned-out son struggling under the weight of an inheritance he wasn't fully prepared for, and an aging father unable to truly relinquish control, even as he claims to want nothing more than peaceful retirement, maps with striking precision onto one of the central tensions running through the entire arc of The Sopranos. In the show, Tony Soprano takes over leadership of the Demio family from his uncle Corrado, known as Junior, after Junior's own imprisonment creates a leadership vacuum, and much of the series' early seasons dramatize the friction. and resentment that arises between the two men as Junior struggles to accept his diminished role while Tony struggles under the weight of responsibilities he's not entirely certain he wants. It's not a direct, literal retelling of the Boiardo family's internal dynamics in the late 1960s, but the emotional shape, generational transition handled badly. An older man unable to fully step aside, a younger man cracking under pressure he didn't fully choose, is unmistakably structurally similar. There's an even more specific, more clinically documented parallel buried in this history, one that speaks directly to the psychological realism that made The Sopranos so groundbreaking in the first place. One of the show's most acclaimed and frequently discussed elements is Tony Soprano's ongoing therapy with psychiatrist Jennifer Melfi, sessions in which the show's central mob boss works through panic attacks, anxiety, and the deep psychological toll of the violent, duplicitous life he leads. A storyline that, as we've already discussed, drew directly on David Chase's own experience in psychotherapy. It turns out, according to research conducted for a book on the Boiardo family's history, that the real Tony Boy Boiardo underwent something remarkably similar decades earlier. According to the book's author, drawing on research into Boiardo family history, Tony Boy worked with a therapist who had previously served as a military doctor, specializing in what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress. Treatment necessitated, according to this research, by the genuine psychological toll of a life that reportedly included witnessing his first murder at the age of just 14, and the ongoing, crushing stress of running a mob organization he'd inherited rather than chosen. Just as fictional viewers came to know Tony Soprano's therapy sessions with Dr. Melfi as one of the show's defining emotional threads, the real Tony Boy Boiardo apparently had his own therapist working through his own trauma, decades before David Chase ever put pen to paper. Beyond the father-son leadership dynamic and the shared experience of psychological treatment for stress brought on by the criminal life, the Boiardo organization provides what may be the single most direct and specific character name parallel in this entire story, one that connects to a beloved figure at the heart of the fictional Demio crew. Within Richie the Boot's organization, there operated a soldier named John Russo, known within the crew by the nickname Big Pussy. According to reporting on the origin of this nickname, it had nothing to do with physical size or intimidating presence. As one might assume from the name alone, it referred instead, somewhat unexpectedly, to Russo's considerable skill as a cat burglar, a nimble, quiet operator capable of slipping in and out of places undetected, much like the animal his nickname invoked. Russo wasn't alone in carrying this kind of nickname within the Boiardo organization. Either another figure connected to the crew, Anthony Russo, was known as Little Pussy, suggesting the nickname carried a particular resonance or tradition within this specific circle, likely tied to a shared reputation among these men for stealth and burglary skill. The connection to the Sopranos here requires no elaborate interpretive work. One of the show's most beloved and enduring characters across its early seasons is Salvatore Bonpensiero, universally known within the fictional Demio crew and to audiences by the nickname Big Pussy, a member of Tony Soprano's inner circle whose eventual fate, once his own cooperation with federal authorities is discovered, becomes one of the series' most emotionally devastating plot developments. The specific nickname, so distinctive and memorable that it's arguably one of the most quoted and referenced details from the entire run of the series, traces directly back to this real Newark mob soldier from the Boiardo crew, whose own reputation as a skilled cat burglar earned him the same unusual moniker decades before. David Chase's writers put it into a fictional character's mouth. It's also worth noting, in this same vein of eerie specificity, that at least two members of the Boiardo organization, soldiers Angelo DiCarlo, known as Jip, and the previously mentioned Anthony Little Pussy Russo, were themselves captured on FBI wiretaps during this same general era, gossiping candidly about the likelihood that Tony Boy Boyardo might eventually be killed by someone within his own organization. A reflection of just how unstable and fractious the internal politics of the Newark crew had become during this period of transition. This detail, once again, echoes the persistent theme of internal betrayal and precarious leadership that runs throughout The Sopranos' entire narrative arc, where Tony's own authority is repeatedly threatened not by outside law enforcement or rival organizations, but by conspiracies and resentments brewing within his own supposedly loyal inner circle. Perhaps the most striking piece of evidence connecting the Boyardo family directly to the Sopranos, however, doesn't come from journalistic detective work piecing together historical parallels after the fact. It comes directly from David Chase himself, and separately from a member of the real Boyardo family. In an interview given in 2002, while the show was still airing and at the height of its cultural influence, Chase was directly asked about the extent to which the series drew on real organized crime history. His response, as reported by New Jersey Monthly and subsequently referenced across numerous other outlets covering the show's real-world inspirations, was that while roughly 90% of the show was invented fictional material, the underlying pattern, the foundational shape the show was built around, was modeled specifically after the Boyardo family. This is a remarkably direct admission, and one that distinguishes the Boyardo connection from the more circumstantial, journalist-assembled parallels that characterize much of the Vincent Palermo comparison. Chase wasn't merely acknowledging that New Jersey's broader organized crime culture had informed his writing in some diffuse, atmospheric sense. He specifically named the Boyardo organization as the pattern, his word, the show's fictional family was built upon. That direct acknowledgement finds an interesting echo from the other side of the historical equation as well. Dr. Richard Boyardo, a descendant of the family and, according to his own public comments, someone raised in relatively close proximity to the family's history and legacy, has stated in interviews that he considers The Sopranos to be fundamentally based on his own family, a claim made despite the fact that HBO and the show's producers have never issued any kind of official, on-the-record confirmation establishing a direct, literal connection between the fictional Demio family and the real Boyardo organization. It's worth noting the natural tension in these two threads of evidence. Chase's own comment describing the Boyardo family as a foundational pattern, offered somewhat offhandedly in a single interview roughly midway through the show's original run, sits alongside a descendant's much stronger, more personal claim of direct inspiration, a claim Chase himself has never gone quite so far as to confirm in equally direct terms. The truth, as with so much of this story, likely sits somewhere between generalized creative inspiration and the kind of definitive, one-to-one source material a descendant, understandably invested in their family's historical legacy, might be inclined to claim with more certainty than the historical record can fully support. What's not in dispute, however, is the sheer density of specific, granular parallels connecting the Boyardo organization to the show, the long driveway leading to a fortress-like suburban estate, the father-son succession crisis, complicated by psychological strain and burnout, the therapist treating trauma decades before Dr. Melfi ever appeared on screen, and perhaps most memorably of all, the direct nickname lineage running from a real Newark cat burglar named Big Pussy Russo straight through to one of the most beloved characters in the history of American television drama. Taken together, these details make the Boyardo family, by a considerable margin, the organization whose specific fingerprints are most visibly, most concretely embedded in the finished show, even if, characteristically, Chase built his fictional world by blending these very real details with material drawn from the DeCavalcantes organization, from Vincent Palermo's contemporary criminal enterprise. and from the considerable creative license Chase exercised throughout. Rather than simply transcribing any single family's history directly onto the screen. Up to this point, we've focused almost entirely on New Jersey, on the DeCavalcantes organization, on Vincent Palermo's strip club and his rise to power, on the Boiardo family's estate and its cat burglar turned television character. And that focus is appropriate because The Sopranos is, first and foremost, a New Jersey story, deliberately set apart from and often gently mocking of the more famous New York organizations that loomed over it, both in fiction and in reality. But it would be a mistake to think the show's criminal DNA came exclusively from New Jersey soil. The Sopranos exists within a much wider ecosystem of American organized crime history and culture, one dominated, for the better part of a century, by the 5 major crime families operating across the river in New York City: the Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese organizations. And even though the show's central family operates deliberately in the shadow of those larger, more famous organizations, even mocked by them, within the show's own internal mythology, much the way the real DeCavalcante family was reportedly regarded by their New York counterparts. The broader aesthetic, the codes of conduct, the internal grammar of how these organizations actually functioned, draws heavily on decades of accumulated knowledge about how the 5 families themselves operated. This broader mafia culture supplied the Sopranos with something the DeCavalcante and Boiardo histories alone couldn't fully provide: a sense of ritual, hierarchy, and formal structure that had been documented and dramatized across decades of prior organized crime history, journalism, and legal proceedings targeting the New York families specifically. The formal induction ceremony a made man goes through, the strict, almost feudal chain of command running from soldier to capo to underboss to boss, with a consigliere serving as counsel and mediator, the concept of sit-downs formal, quasi-diplomatic meetings convened to resolve disputes between crews or between entire families, governed by their own unwritten rules of procedure and etiquette, designed to prevent minor disagreements from escalating into the kind of open, bloody warfare that draws unwanted attention from law enforcement and destabilizes an entire criminal ecosystem. These aren't details David Chase needed to invent from scratch, and they aren't details unique to the DeCavalcante or Boiardo organizations specifically. They're the accumulated institutional knowledge of decades of American mafia history, much of it originally exposed through New York-focused law enforcement investigations, congressional testimony, and landmark informant cooperation. Most famously, perhaps the testimony of Joseph Falakay, whose 1963 Senate testimony first introduced the American public to many of the internal terms and structures that would later become common vocabulary in mob films and television. Terms like made man and omerta entering the broader public consciousness for the first time. The Sopranos absorbed this larger institutional grammar and layered it on top of the more specific, more granular New Jersey details we've already discussed: the strip club headquarters, the pork store gathering spots, the father-son succession dynamics, creating a fictional world that felt, to audiences and to real wise guys alike, simultaneously specific to its particular New Jersey setting and recognizably, authentically part of the broader American mafia tradition that had been building in the public imagination since well before Chase was even born. One area where this broader institutional knowledge proves especially important to understanding the show is in its portrayal of federal informant culture. The show's persistent, anxiety-inducing thread of characters, wondering who among them might be secretly cooperating with the FBI, wearing a wire, working toward their own reduced sentence at the expense of the organization's collective safety. This wasn't an invented dramatic device conjured purely for narrative tension. It reflected the genuine, structural reality of American organized crime by the final decades of the 20th century. a reality shaped by decades of aggressive federal prosecution, using increasingly sophisticated surveillance technology, and, critically, by the systematic strengthening of federal racketeering law throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. As RICO prosecutions, cases brought under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, became an increasingly powerful and frequently used tool against organized crime families across the country. The calculus facing individual mob members shifted dramatically. Decades-long prison sentences, made newly achievable through RICO's broad conspiracy provisions, created enormous pressure on lower-ranking members and associates to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for leniency. And as we've already discussed with respect to the DeCavalcantes organization specifically, this pressure produced exactly the kind of cascading cooperation that gradually hollowed out organized crime families across the entire country during this period, New Jersey very much included. By the time Chase was developing and writing The Sopranos in the mid to late 1990s, this informant dynamic wasn't abstract history. It was the lived, current reality shaping every organized crime family still operating in America. The DeCavalcantes organization very much among them. The federal investigation targeting Vincent Palermo's own organization, the one that would eventually lead to his cooperation and entry into witness protection, was itself built substantially on informant testimony and cooperating witnesses turning on their former associates, a pattern that repeated across the family's leadership throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s. Multiple top-ranking members beyond Palermo himself, including men who had held significant positions of trust and authority within the organization, ultimately agreed to become government witnesses as federal pressure mounted, providing testimony that helped dismantle much of the family's remaining structure. This wasn't a single dramatic betrayal, the kind of clean narrative arc a screenwriter might invent for maximum emotional impact. It was a slow, grinding, cumulative erosion, one cooperating witness leading to the exposure that pressured the next. Across years of overlapping federal indictments, The Sopranos dramatizes something very close to this same dynamic across its own run, most memorably and devastatingly in the storyline involving Big Pussy Bon Pensiero, the character named, as we discussed earlier, after the real Newark cat burglar from the Boyardo crew, whose secret cooperation with the FBI and its ultimate discovery and consequences form one of the show's most gutting emotional arcs. Beyond the informant culture, the broader New York Mafia tradition also informs the specific texture of how Tony Soprano's legitimate business fronts function within the show, an area where the real-world economics of organized crimes, infiltration into legal industries provides essential grounding for understanding why the show's portrayal feels so procedurally convincing rather than merely decorative. Across the run of the series, Tony's crew operates a waste management company as one of its primary legitimate-facing business fronts, alongside various construction-adjacent enterprises and labor union connections that provide both laundering opportunities for illegal proceeds and additional avenues for extortion and kickback schemes. This wasn't an arbitrary choice of cover industry. Waste management and construction had, by the final decades of the 20th century, become two of the single most heavily mob-infiltrated legitimate industries in the greater New York and New Jersey metropolitan region, a reality extensively documented across decades of law enforcement investigation, congressional hearings, and journalism covering organized crime's economic footprint in the Northeast. And this is an area notably where the show's portrayal tracks with remarkable precision onto the DeCavalcantes family's own actual documented criminal enterprise. Not merely the broader New York Mafia tradition, but the DeCavalcantes organization specifically. Multiple federal indictments brought against the DeCavalcantes family across the 1980s, 90s, and into the 2000s centered directly on labor racketeering within the construction industry, including extensive infiltration of a laborers' international union local based in Elizabeth, New Jersey, the same city notably that had served as one of the DeCavalcanti family's core operational bases for decades. Family leadership, including figures who rose to acting boss status, were documented using control over this union local to extort payoffs from contractors in exchange for labor peace, to control which workers were placed on which job sites, and to skim money through kickback schemes and fraudulently created no-show jobs, positions that existed only on paper, generating a paycheck for someone who never actually showed up to perform any work, with the proceeds funneled back into the organization. Separately, federal indictments brought against the family in the early 2000s specifically cited extortion within the construction industry and stock fraud schemes as core charges, part of a broader case that also included charges related to multiple murders and murder conspiracies, a stark illustration of just how thoroughly violent criminal enterprise and seemingly mundane, paperwork-driven economic racketeering had become intertwined within the organization's actual operations by this period. This is, in other words, precisely the kind of criminal economy The Sopranos dramatizes through Tony Soprano's waste management business and his various construction industry entanglements, not a generic, symbolic stand-in for organized crime's broader illegality, but a specific, well-documented category of real criminal enterprise that the actual family serving as one of the show's core inspirations was, at the very time Chase was writing, actively engaged in, under active federal investigation, and would eventually be substantially prosecuted for. Beyond waste management and construction, the show's persistent portrayal of bookmaking operations, loan sharking, extortion rackets targeting local businesses, hijacking of goods in transit, and various forms of fraud similarly reflects, in granular detail, the documented core business activities of the real DeCavalcanti organization across its decades of operation. Federal and state law enforcement records describe the family's illicit portfolio as including construction and cement industry violations, drug trafficking, extortion, the fencing of stolen goods, various forms of fraud, illegal gambling operations, the hijacking of cargo, a long-standing organized crime, specialty in the densely trafficked ports and shipping corridors of the greater New York and New Jersey region, labor racketeering, loan sharking, money laundering, and murder when circumstances required it. Watching Tony Soprano and his crew move fluidly across these same categories of criminal enterprise throughout the series, running numbers out of the back of a pork store one episode, shaking down a local business owner the next, arranging for a truckload of stolen electronics to be moved through a fence the episode after that, isn't simply good, atmospheric mob drama writing. It's a close, if fictionalized and dramatically heightened, reflection of the actual, documented criminal economy the DeCavalcanti organization operated within for the better part of half a century. What emerges from all of this, when you step back and look at the full picture, is a portrait of a television show built with considerably more procedural rigor than its reputation as a psychologically driven character study might suggest to someone who's never actually watched it closely. Yes, The Sopranos is fundamentally a show about a troubled man's internal life, about generational trauma, about the particular anxieties of a certain kind of American masculinity confronting its own obsolescence and moral rot. But the criminal infrastructure surrounding that psychological drama, the businesses, the rackets, the informant paranoia, the specific mechanics of how money moves through a criminal organization and gets laundered into something resembling legitimacy, is drawn with a level of specificity and accuracy that draws directly on the actual, documented operations of the DeCavalcanti crime family, layered on top of the broader institutional knowledge accumulated across decades of American Mafia history, centered in the New York Five families. It's this combination, deeply personal psychological fiction, wrapped around a scaffolding of genuinely researched, historically grounded criminal procedure, that gives the show its distinctive, still unmatched sense of authenticity. Chase wasn't simply writing what he imagined mob life might feel like. He was writing what mob life, according to decades of court records, journalism, and the DeCavalcantes organization's own documented history, actually was. Having spent the last several acts tracing just how deeply and specifically the Sopranos drew on real organized crime history, Sam DeCavalcante's bugged office, Vincent Palermo's strip club, the Boiardo family's estate, and its cat burglar turned television icon, the broader documented criminal economy of construction racketeering and waste, management fraud, it's worth pausing now to address something equally important, and something the show's creator himself has been consistently, explicitly clear about across years of interviews. Tony Soprano is not a one-to-one portrait of any single real man. He never was intended to be. This distinction matters enormously, and it's easy to lose sight of once you've spent this much time tracing specific, granular parallels between fiction and documented history. It would be a mistake to walk away from everything we've discussed so far believing that. David Chase sat down with a folder of DeCavalcante case files, a biography of Vincent Palermo, and a family history of the Boiardo organization, and simply transcribed real events onto fictional characters with the serial numbers filed off. That's not what happened, and it's not, according to Chase's own repeated public statements, what he was trying to do. What actually happened was something considerably more sophisticated, and considerably more interesting from a creative standpoint. Chase took specific, real documented details, a strip club headquarters, a father-son succession crisis complicated by therapy and psychological breakdown, a beloved crew member's nickname traced to a real cat burglar, the granular mechanics of construction industry extortion, and wove them together into a composite character and a composite organization, one deliberately assembled from multiple real sources precisely, so that no single real person or family could see themselves as the definitive, exclusive inspiration. Consider for a moment just how differently these real men's stories actually ended compared to how the show chose to resolve its own central narrative. The series finale of The Sopranos remains, to this day, one of the most discussed, most deliberately ambiguous conclusions in the history of American television. A moment cutting to black mid-scene, leaving audiences to debate for years afterward whether Tony Soprano lived, died, or existed in some permanent, unresolved state of dread, forever awaiting a violent reckoning that may or may not ever actually arrive. It's a bold, operatic, distinctly theatrical choice, one that prioritizes psychological and thematic resonance over any pretense of realistic narrative closure. Compare that to what actually happened to Vincent Palermo, the real man whose life provides the closest single real-world template for Tony Soprano's rise. His strip club headquarters and his internal power dynamics. Palermo's story didn't end in ambiguity, and it certainly didn't end in the kind of violent, unresolved tension the show's finale gestures toward. It ended, as we discussed earlier, in a federal cooperation agreement, a confession to accumulated decades of crimes, a reduced sentence secured in exchange for testimony against his former associates, an eventual quiet disappearance into the witness protection program under a new identity. There's nothing operatic about that ending. It's bureaucratic. It's the unglamorous, paperwork-heavy conclusion that increasingly defined how organized crime careers actually terminated by the late 20th and early 21st centuries. As decades of strengthened federal racketeering law made cooperation the rational, self-preserving choice for men facing the alternative of dying in federal prison. Real organized crime, by this era, rarely ended with a dramatic shootout or a poetic ambush at a diner. It usually ended with a plea agreement and a new name in a new state. This divergence between the show's operatic fictional ending and the real, unglamorous fates of the men who inspired it isn't a flaw in the show's authenticity. Quite the opposite. It's a deliberate, thoughtful, creative choice that reveals something important about what Chase was actually trying to accomplish across the show's full run. He wasn't making a documentary. However extensively he drew on documented real-world criminal history to build his fictional world's procedural texture. He was making a psychological drama, one interested in exploring what it might feel like to live inside the constant, grinding dread of a life built on violence and betrayal. The show's famous ambiguous ending functions thematically as a kind of permanent extension of that dread, denying audiences the cathartic closure a more conventional crime drama might have offered, precisely because that unresolved anxiety was always the point, more so than any specific factual outcome. Real organized crime figures like Palermo eventually got their resolution. However, unglamorous cooperation, relocation, a quiet ending to a violent career. Tony Soprano, as a character, was never meant to get that resolution, because Chase wanted his audience sitting indefinitely in exactly the kind of anxious uncertainty that defines the character's entire psychological experience across the series. This is also fundamentally why Chase chose to build his fictional family out of composite details drawn from multiple real organizations, rather than dramatizing any single real case directly. Had he built the show as a direct, thinly fictionalized retelling of, say, Vincent Palermo's specific biography, or the Boiardo family's specific multi-generational history, he would have been constrained by the actual, documented facts of those real cases bound to follow. More or less, the real chronology, the real outcomes, the real legal proceedings that had already played out and were, by the show's production era, at least partially matters of public record. By instead assembling a composite, Palermo's strip club and his rise through violence, the Boiardo family's father-son succession crisis, and its cat burglar nickname, the broader DeCavalcantes organization's construction and waste management racketeering, Sam DeCavalcante's own foundational tapes revealing the mundane emotional texture beneath the violence. Chase gave himself the creative freedom to build toward whatever thematic and psychological destination the story actually needed, unconstrained by the specific, sometimes anticlimactic realities of how any single real case had actually concluded. There's a broader lesson here about how the best fiction drawing on real history tends to work, one worth sitting with as we move toward the final stretch of this story. The Sopranos endures and continues to be studied and rewatched and picked apart by both casual fans and serious television scholars decades after its original run, not because it's a meticulous, journalistically accurate account of any single real crime family's history. It endures because Chase understood something crucial about the relationship between fact and fiction. That specific, real, well-researched detail, a real strip club, a real nickname, a real construction racket, a real bugged office revealing the mundane texture of mob life, gives fiction its credibility, its sense of lived-in authenticity, while the freedom to depart from any single real narrative gives that same fiction its psychological depth, its thematic coherence, its ability to say something true about the human condition that a strict, literal docudrama retelling of any single real case might never have been able to achieve. It's worth extending this idea of the composite character a little further, because it helps explain something that trips up a lot of casual viewers, and even some fairly dedicated fans of the show: the persistent, ongoing public debate over who the real Tony Soprano actually was. If you search around online, you'll find no shortage of articles, forum threads, and video essays, each confidently arguing for a different single answer. some insisting it's definitively Vincent Palermo, others making the case for one of the Boiardo men, still others pointing to entirely different regional mob figures whose biographies share a few surface details with the character. The truth, as we've now spent several acts establishing, is that this entire framing, the search for one single, definitive real Tony Soprano, is somewhat beside the point. However understandable the impulse behind it might be, human beings are pattern-seeking creatures, and when we encounter a piece of fiction that feels this specific, this granular, this uncannily well-observed, our instinct is to assume there must be a single, hidden factual key that unlocks the whole thing. A real person, a real event, a real family that the writer simply transcribed with minimal alteration. It's a satisfying story to tell, and it makes for a tidy headline, but it flattens what actually happened in the writer's room, and it undersells the genuine creative sophistication of what Chase and his team accomplished. The far more interesting and far more historically accurate story is the one we've been tracing across this entire narration. A writer, deeply immersed in a specific regional criminal culture through decades of proximity and research, who took real, verified details from multiple overlapping sources, a strip club here, a nickname there, a father-son psychological crisis somewhere else, a construction racket lifted almost wholesale from actual court documents and stitched them together into something new, something that could feel, to different observers looking for different things, like it was really about their particular family or their particular boss, precisely because it drew genuine, specific material from several different real families and several different real bosses simultaneously. This composite approach extends well beyond Tony Soprano himself, worth noting briefly here, and applies across much of the show's central cast of characters. Christopher Moltisanti, Tony's volatile young protege, draws on the general pattern of mentor relationships common across organized crime families of this era, not on any single, specifically documented real relationship the way the Big Pussy nickname traces to one particular real man. Paulie Galtieri, the aging, superstitious, endlessly complaining capo who serves as one of the show's most enduring sources of dark comic relief, reflects a recognizable archetype found across decades of organized crime culture and journalism. Rather than any single documented individual, Junior Soprano, Tony's bitter, aging uncle, struggling with the indignity of being passed over for leadership in favor of his nephew, echoes the broader generational tension we've already discussed with respect to the Boiardo family's own father-son succession crisis, without being a direct, one-to-one transcription of any specific real relationship. This is how the composite method works across an entire fictional ensemble, not just its central character, real texture drawn from multiple documented sources, reassembled into new configurations designed to serve the specific psychological and narrative needs of the story Chase actually wanted to tell. Understanding this composite method also helps clarify something important about how we should approach true crime storytelling, like the video you're watching right now. It would be easy, and in some ways more dramatically satisfying, to present this entire story as a simple, linear equation. DeCavalcante equals this fictional element. Palermo equals that fictional element. Boiardo equals this other fictional element. Add them together, and you've fully explained the show. But the honest version of this story, the version grounded in what journalists, documentarians, and Chase himself have actually established over the years, is considerably messier and considerably more interesting than that. The Sopranos isn't a puzzle with a single hidden solution waiting to be discovered. It's closer to a kind of alchemy, real historical material, genuinely researched and genuinely accurate in its granular details, transformed through deliberate creative recombination into something that transcends any single one of its real-world sources, while still remaining recognizably verifiably rooted in all of them. We've spent most of this story looking backward, tracing the real history that fed into the show before it ever aired, examining the documented lives of Sam DeCavalcantes, Vincent Palermo, and the Boiardo family across the decades leading up to the Sopranos' 1999 premiere. But there's another, equally fascinating dimension to this story that unfolds after the show became a cultural phenomenon: the strange, often surreal experience of the show's actual cast and crew encountering real organized crime figures during the years the series was in production. Men who had, by that point, watched enough of the show to have developed genuine, sometimes uncomfortably specific opinions about how well the actors were doing their jobs. This dynamic real wise guys offering unsolicited professional feedback to the actors, playing fictionalized versions of themselves, became something of a recurring, semi-legendary thread in cast interviews given over the years since the show ended, particularly around anniversary retrospectives and press tours for related projects like the 2021 prequel film. Steve Sciarpa, who played Bobby Bacalieri across the show's later seasons, has spoken on multiple occasions about real, mob-connected men approaching him unprompted in public, stopping him on the street, calling him directly, to offer advice on how various aspects of the criminal lifestyle depicted on the show ought to be portrayed with greater accuracy. According to accounts Sciarpa has given in interviews, on at least one occasion, while simply going about the ordinary business of doing his laundry, he was approached by someone offering, with apparently genuine sincerity, detailed instruction on the correct technique for a certain kind of violent act. Advice Sciarpa, by his own account, wisely declined to accept or act upon in any way, understanding the interaction for the strange, faintly unsettling brush with reality that it was. Sciarpa wasn't alone in receiving this kind of unsolicited real-world consultation. Michael Imperioli, who played Christopher Moltisanti, has described a similar encounter in interviews given alongside Sciarpa, recalling being offered, by a real mob-connected individual, an informal lesson in the specific mechanics of strangulation using piano wire, a chillingly specific and disturbing offer that Imperioli, like Sciarpa with his own unsolicited advice, declined to take up. These anecdotes, however darkly comic they've become in retrospect through repeated retelling on talk shows and press tours, speak to something genuinely remarkable about the show's cultural penetration into the very world it was dramatizing. These weren't casual viewers offering fan feedback the way audiences might critique any other prestige drama. These were, by the actors' own accounts, individuals connected to the actual criminal world the show was drawing from, evaluating the show's depiction of violence and criminal technique against their own genuine, lived expertise, and apparently feeling strongly enough about the show's accuracy, or its occasional inaccuracy, to seek out the actors directly and offer correction. Perhaps the most memorable version of this dynamic, according to accounts given by cast members over the years, involves James Gandolfini himself, the actor whose towering, deeply humane performance as Tony Soprano across 6 seasons remains, to this day, one of the most acclaimed performances in television history. While specific details of the advice Gandolfini reportedly received from real organized crime figures during the show's run have circulated in slightly varying forms across different retellings by his former castmates, the broader pattern is consistent across these accounts. Even the show's lead actor, playing its most central fictional character, found himself on the receiving end of real-world commentary and advice from men connected to the actual criminal culture the show was dramatizing, a testament to just how seriously and how personally this world took its own fictional reflection. Steve Sciarpa has offered perhaps the single most evocative summary of just how thoroughly the show penetrated into its own real-world source material's actual audience, recounting, in interviews given over the years, a running joke among the cast and crew during the show's original broadcast run. That organized crime activity in the greater New York and New Jersey area reliably dipped on Sunday nights. Because, according to the joke, the men who would ordinarily have been out conducting business were instead at home, in front of their televisions. Watching the show, it's a joke, obviously. Not a documented statistical claim, but it captures something genuinely true about the phenomenon we spent. Act 4 of this story examining in detail a real crime family, captured on federal surveillance, unable to look away from its own fictional reflection, recognizing its own pork stores and its own strip clubs broadcast weekly into millions of American homes. This strange loop, a real crime family flattered, unsettled, and thoroughly entertained by watching a fictionalized, dramatized, deliberately composite version of its own culture, is, in many ways, the perfect encapsulation of everything this story has been building toward. It's rare, in the entire history of American popular culture, for a piece of fiction to achieve this precise, uncanny a relationship with the real-world subject matter it draws from, specific enough to be instantly, viscerally recognizable to the actual people living that life, while remaining, simultaneously, thoroughly fictional, thoroughly composite, thoroughly the product of one writer's deeply personal psychological preoccupations grafted onto a genre setting. Real men, actually part of the actual DeCavalcantes organization, sat in actual rooms under actual federal surveillance and discussed the show as though it were, on some level, actually about them, and in the specific, granular details we've traced across this entire narration. In the most meaningful sense that matters, it genuinely was. There's one more thread worth pulling on before we close this out, because it speaks to just how long this strange feedback loop actually persisted after the show itself went off the air in 2007. Cast members have noted, in interviews given well into the years following the finale, that the recognition never really faded the way it might have for a more conventional crime drama. Steve Sciurpa and Michael Imperioli, hosting a rewatch podcast together years after the series ended, have described continuing to hear from people connected to that world, not always with corrections or unsolicited technique advice by that point, but increasingly with a kind of wistful ownership. Older men reminiscing about the show the way someone might reminisce about a documentary of their own youth, even though nothing about it was ever pitched, written, or marketed as documentary at all. It became, over time, less a mirror they were startled to encounter, and more a mirror they'd grown almost fond of. However uncomfortable the original reflection had been, that shift matters, because it says something about how thoroughly the show outlived its own sources. Sam DeCavalcante was gone before the first episode aired. Richie the Boot Boyardo had died years earlier still. Vincent Palermo disappeared into a new identity while the show was still in production, and the organization all three men had spent their lives building was, by the time the series concluded, functionally hollowed out by decades of cooperating witnesses and federal prosecution, a shadow of what it had been when Chase first started drawing on it for material. The fiction, in other words, ended up outlasting almost everything real that had fed into it. The DeCavalcante family as an operating criminal enterprise faded. The DiMeo family, invented, composite, and never real to begin with, is still being watched, argued over, and re-watched by new audiences who weren't even born when those FBI agents in Newark first sat up and started listening a little more closely to what was coming through their headphones. This is why The Sopranos endures as something considerably more significant than just a well-made crime drama. Decades after its original broadcast run concluded, and long after most of the specific real organizations and real men whose lives fed into its writing have themselves faded from active operation, cooperated with federal authorities, or, in cases like Sam DeCavalcante's, simply passed away from natural causes. The show endures because it achieved a genuinely rare synthesis, grounding a deeply personal, deeply psychological story about American masculinity, family dysfunction, and inherited trauma in a criminal world researched and rendered with enough specific, verifiable accuracy that the actual people living inside that world recognize themselves in it, sometimes uncomfortably, sometimes with something approaching genuine pride, and in at least one remarkable, well-documented instance, on federal surveillance tape that would later help convict some of them. David Chase set out, by his own repeated account, to tell a story about his own mother, his own therapy, his own complicated relationship to the particular brand of anxious, defensive American manhood he'd grown up surrounded by in North Jersey. He used organized crime as his vehicle because it was the world he knew, the world sitting right there in his own regional history, ready-made with exactly the kind of high stakes, life and death consequences that could make his deeply personal, psychological material feel genuinely dramatic rather than merely introspective. In doing so, almost as a byproduct of simply writing what he knew, he ended up producing one of the most historically grounded fictional depictions of American organized crime ever put to screen, accurate enough, specific enough that Sam DeCavalcante's bugged plumbing office, Vincent Palermo's strip club, and Richie the Boot Boyardo's long Livingston driveway all live on, quietly, inside a fictional world millions of people around the world continue to discover and re-watch to this day, most of them with no idea just how real, in the end, so much of it actually was. And that's the story. The real families, the real bosses, the real bugged offices and strip clubs and long driveways that quietly became the foundation for one of the greatest television dramas ever made. If you've made it this far, thank you for spending this time with us tonight. And if you're already drifting off, that's all right too. Let it keep playing. We covered a lot of ground. A bugged plumbing office in the 60s, a strip club owner who became a real boss right as the cameras started rolling, a Newark crew whose cat burglar gave a beloved character his name, and a real family who ended up watching, on their own television, a mirror of themselves. If you enjoyed this one, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And a like genuinely helps this reach more people who'd enjoy falling asleep to it just as much as you did. And before you go, drop a comment letting us know where you watched from tonight, and what time it was when you finally reached the end. We've got another sleepy gangster story coming soon. Another real family. Another real history hiding just behind the fiction. So if you like this one, stick around for that. Good night.